On the 6th of June 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy, codenamed Operation Overlord, began. It was the largest seaborne invasion in history, and this began the liberation of France, as the German forces who had occupied the nation for years began to be pushed back. D-Day took a huge amount of planning, and there were incredible attempts made to deceive the enemy, but also the operation encountered problems, as it had to be put back 24 hours. However, there were things that did not go well on D-Day, as at Omaha and on many of the other beaches, there was a significant amount of resistance put up. The shores were mined and barbed wire covered the beachhead, and to make things worse, there were many machine gun emplacements and other fortifications established to repel the Allies. Following the intense fighting, the pushback was finally achieved, and the importance of the Normandy Landings was to establish just a foothold in France for the Allies to then build on. But in the heat of battle, in the chaos that emerged, as many men fell on the beaches, there were some brutal reprisals carried out upon captured German prisoners of war. Welcome to the Untold Past. Today we look at the executions of the D-Day landings, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The fighting on D-Day was incredibly intense, and many of the men who landed in the first wave saw their friends and comrades killed, and it must have been psychological hell. Because of this, a number of war crimes were carried out in the aftermath of the landings. One thing to consider is that the Allies, when they made advances, did not have the time often to take prisoners, and because of this some men were slaughtered and killed when they should have been probably taken as prisoners of war and given this form of protection. Some German soldiers had surrendered, but they were still shot by British, Canadian and American forces, and in the Normandy region there were a number of French eyewitnesses who later spoke out about German soldiers who were executed in the days following or on D-Day. Some of these troops that shot were said to have been Allied paratroopers involved in the executions. For example, at La Hagueri, close to Andilleville, La Hubert, it was claimed that American paratroopers executed roughly 25 German prisoners by the side of a road on the afternoon of D-Day, following the landings. A number of these soldiers who were executed, it was said, had been wounded fighting defending the beachhead, codenamed Utah. These German soldiers were allegedly held in front of a farm for a number of hours, until the Americans guarded them, then turned their weapons on them and shot them dead. It has been considered that the men who did this belonged to the 502nd Parachute Infantry. But over the following days there were more instances of executions being carried out upon prisoners of war, and this was more common than has been documented. Individual soldiers took it upon themselves to act as executioners, and also as judge and jury when dealing with the fate of prisoners of war. For example, on the 8th of June, a number of armoured cars allegedly from the Inns of Court Regiment moved south. They took some German artillery officers as prisoners of war, and it's believed that in total there were 10 men who were captured. These belonged to the Panzer Artillery Lehr Regiment, and they were considering how to set up their guns. But after being captured and interrogated, some of these men were then ordered to march in front of the armoured cars of the Allies to act as human shields, which in itself would have been considered a war crime. The officers refused to do this, and one senior officer, Oberst Luxemburger, was then beaten by the soldiers and was knocked unconscious. It was then claimed that he was strapped to the front of an armoured car, and with him in this precarious position, the anti-tank guns of the 12th Panzer Division opened up fire and knocked out the armoured cars. Oberst Luxemburger was taken to hospital, and he later succumbed to his wounds. But much of this account comes from a man who was later tried as a German war criminal. Information had got back to the German lines that accused the British of routinely, allegedly executing prisoners captured in the advances. One thing to consider is that the German forces were considered much more disciplined than this, and despite Allied units occasionally shooting prisoners, it wasn't really a widespread practice. One quote from around this time of the landings came from a Canadian soldier who said, "The Germans weren't too eager to surrender. We never took any SS prisoners, and sometimes dealt with the Wehrmacht formations in the same way." The SS officers and members were seen as prized targets for execution by many Allied soldiers, as they were considered the most dangerous soldiers, and also those who were the most ardent of Nazis, and many Allied soldiers had heard about the crimes that the SS members had been involved in. One man who gained a fearful reputation amongst a number of American soldiers has had his story told in part of the miniseries Band of Brothers. Lieutenant Colonel Ronald Charles Speirs was assigned to D Company of the 2nd Battalion before the Normandy invasions, and he would later become the commander of E Company as the Americans drove into Belgium. He also at the end of the war became a captain and went on to serve in the Korean War, but his story on D-Day saw him parachute into Normandy on the 6th of June 1944, and he met up with other American forces after landing. He gathered a small group of soldiers and they captured a 105mm howitzer gun, but he then commanded with his unit spending the night moving into position ready for the battles the following morning. It was during the early hours before the landings that Speirs was allegedly involved in a number of incidents, and this gained him a ruthless reputation amongst other American forces. He, hours before the D-Day invasion began, accepted the surrender of 3 German soldiers who had given themselves up to his men. However, Speirs then at some point apparently gave an order to execute the men. This was of course a war crime, as these soldiers had surrendered and were technically prisoners of war. Also later in the day, on the 6th, Speirs was said to have personally, with his machine gun, shot 4 to 5 soldiers who were surrendering to him. He was a man who was not intent on taking any prisoners alive. But there were more incidents, as Speirs then shot a sergeant, an American sergeant, in self-defence. One witness, a private first class DiMarzio, claimed that he was lying next to the drunken sergeant. The order to hold the position was given and relayed, but this sergeant refused to obey, and he wanted to move forward and attack the Germans head-on. Speirs repeated the order, but the sergeant refused and allegedly went to grab his rifle, and Speirs warned the sergeant not to do this. Speirs then allegedly shot the sergeant in self-defence in front of a number of other American soldiers, and he immediately reported this to the commanding officer. It was deemed as sufficient self-defence, and Speirs got away with this, as the commanding officer was killed the following day. This was a man who was more than happy to execute someone, even on his own side, if it meant ensuring discipline. Speirs was seen by his fellow soldiers as one of the finest combat officers, and Captain Richard Winters later claimed that he was a man who earned a reputation as a killer, and that he killed for shock value, and he claimed that on one occasion, Speirs was known to have executed 6 German prisoners of war with his Thompson machine gun, but these charges were ignored. There were a number of reasons why the Allies executed German soldiers on D-Day or in the days after. Some soldiers were angry at seeing their fellow men cut down, and the brutality of the landings and the resistance only added to this. Others believed that it was necessary tactically to do this, as prisoners of war were a strain on resources. They did not have the manpower to ensure these German soldiers were dealt with well. Another reason was revenge, as the SS had executed and committed terrible war crimes, much of which had been well documented. One thing to consider is that later on there was a huge large-scale massacre of 158 prisoners of war, with Canadian soldiers being slaughtered by the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.